Welcome back for another deep dive. I love getting into the really weird stuff, and today we're going there. Today, we're tackling panpsychism.
Okay.
You've sent me a really great overview, so we're going to explore this idea that consciousness
Yeah.
might be a fundamental property of the universe, not just limited to brains.
Right.
So,
Yeah, definitely a fascinating concept that challenges a lot of our assumptions about uh, the nature of reality, for sure.
to start this idea that everything has some level of consciousness,
Hmm.
where did that even come from? It sounds pretty radical,
Yeah.
right?
It might sound radical at first, but the idea has been around for centuries. Like ancient philosophers like Sales of Miletus,
Okay.
back in the 6th century BC, believed that everything is full of gods.
Wow.
Well, that might not be how we phrase it today.
Right. Yeah.
It points to like an early intuition that the world might be teeming with some form of awareness.
So the idea of a conscious universe isn't as new as it seems.
Right.
But how does panpsychism approach what's often called the hard problem of consciousness?
Right. The hard problem. That's the puzzle of how subjective experience, feelings, sensations, what it's like to be, arises from physical matter.
Hmm.
Panpsychism kind of flips this on its head.
Okay.
It suggests that instead of trying to explain how consciousness emerges, we should consider the possibility that it's always been there, a fundamental feature of reality itself.
So instead of consciousness arising from complexity,
Mm.
it's more like complexity just allows that fundamental consciousness to express itself in different ways.
Exactly. Think of it like a spectrum of consciousness.
Okay.
A rock might have a very basic level of awareness, a simple being, while a human brain, with its complex structure, allows for a much richer, more dynamic experience of consciousness.
That makes sense, but wouldn't that mean that literally everything,
Right.
from the smallest particle to the largest galaxy, has some level of consciousness?
Yeah.
But where do we even draw the line?
That's a key question that panpsychism grapples with.
Yeah.
Some variations, like micropsychism,
Okay.
propose that consciousness exists at the very tiniest levels of reality, in atoms and subatomic particles.
So our thoughts and feelings could be the result of a massive collaboration of tiny conscious particles.
Right.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But it's one way to address the combination problem. That's the challenge of explaining how those tiny bits of consciousness, if they exist, could combine to create the unified, complex consciousness that we experience.
So that does seem like a pretty big hurdle for panpsychism to overcome.
Yeah.
How do they even begin to explain that?
There are different approaches.
Yeah.
Some panpsychists suggest that there are principles of organization or combination that govern how these micro-consciousnesses interact and integrate to form larger, more complex conscious entities.
So there might be a sort of hierarchy of consciousness building from the smallest units up to the complex systems we see in nature.
Yes. And that hierarchy might even extend beyond individual organisms.
Hmm.
Some proponents, like those who support cosmopsychism, suggest that the entire universe itself might be a single, vast conscious entity.
That raises even more questions.
It does.
How could we even begin to wrap our minds around a universe-sized consciousness? And what does that even mean for us as individuals?
Those are some of the big questions that cosmopsychism tries to address. It proposes that our individual consciousnesses might be like fragments or expressions of this larger universal mind.
That's a pretty profound concept to consider. But if consciousness is truly fundamental to reality, wouldn't that have major implications for how we understand the world and our place in it?
Absolutely. It challenges many of our scientific assumptions
sure.
and raises ethical questions about how we interact with everything around us.
This is definitely a deep dive, and
Yeah.
we've only just scratched the surface. I'm ready to keep exploring, especially the arguments for and against panpsychism. What are some of the key points of contention?
Well, one of the main criticisms is that panpsychism adds unnecessary complexity to our understanding of the world. Critics argue that it might be more parsimonious to stick with the idea that consciousness emerges from complex systems, even if we don't fully understand how yet.
That's a fair point. But on the other hand, doesn't panpsychism offer a more elegant explanation for the continuity of consciousness in nature?
That's one of the key arguments in its favor. The idea that there's no clear dividing line where consciousness suddenly appears.
Right.
It seems to exist on a spectrum,
Yeah.
from the very simple to the incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Panpsychism provides a framework for understanding that continuity.
And it also tackles the intrinsic nature of matter, right?
Yes.
Our current scientific models do a great job of describing the external properties of matter, but they don't really account for the internal subjective experience.
Exactly. Panpsychism suggests that consciousness is the intrinsic nature of matter itself, the flip side of the objective properties we can measure and observe.
So instead of trying to explain how consciousness arises from matter, it's suggesting that consciousness is an inherent aspect of matter itself.
Precisely.
This is getting really interesting, and I want to dig deeper into the implications of all this. But first, let's take a closer look at some of the key thinkers who've shaped the modern debate around panpsychism. Who are some of the major voices in this conversation?
When we look at the contemporary landscape,
Hmm.
there are several prominent figures who have brought panpsychism back into the philosophical and scientific spotlight. One of them is David Chalmers,
Oh, yeah.
the philosopher who really brought the hard problem to the forefront.
Right, he's not necessarily a full-fledged panpsychist,
Yeah.
but he's certainly open to the idea, right?
Exactly. He sees it as a potential solution to the hard problem and has engaged in thoughtful discussions about its merits and challenges.
So he's acknowledging that our current materialistic worldview might be missing something crucial when it comes to understanding consciousness.
Yes, and then you have someone like Galen Strawson, who's a strong advocate for panpsychism. He argues that any attempt to explain consciousness solely in terms of physical processes is bound to fail.
Okay.
He believes that experience the feeling of what it's like to be is simply fundamental.
So for Strawson, it's not about explaining how consciousness emerges from matter, but rather accepting that consciousness is an inherent aspect of reality itself.
Precisely. And another key figure is Philip Goff, who has done a lot to popularize panpsychism and make it more accessible to a wider audience.
Okay.
He sees it as a way to bridge the gap between mind and matter, to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview.
It's fascinating to see how these thinkers are pushing the boundaries of our understanding of consciousness. But beyond the theoretical debates, what are some of the practical implications of panpsychism?
Yeah.
How could it potentially change the way we live and interact with the world?
That's where things get really interesting. One of the most profound implications is that it could lead to a more ethical and compassionate approach to all forms of life, and even to what we traditionally consider inanimate matter.
So if we acknowledge that even a rock might possess some level of awareness, however faint,
Yeah,
it changes our entire relationship with the world around us.
absolutely. It encourages us to treat all things with respect and consideration, recognizing that we're part of a larger web of consciousness.
It makes you reconsider those moments when you might thoughtlessly kick a stone down the path or toss something in the trash without a second thought.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this extends beyond our interactions with individual objects
Right.
to our relationship with the environment as a whole.
Okay.
Panpsychism could be a powerful force for promoting ecological awareness and sustainability.
I can see how it would. If we recognize that the planet and all its ecosystems are potentially teeming with various forms of consciousness, it makes environmentalism not just a matter of preserving resources, but also of respecting the interconnected web of experience.
Precisely. And this sense of interconnectedness goes beyond the environment. Panpsychism could have profound implications for how we understand and relate to each other.
If our individual consciousnesses are all expressions of a larger universal mind, as cosmopsychism suggests,
Yeah.
then the idea of interconnectedness takes on a whole new dimension.
Yes. And it raises intriguing questions about empathy and compassion.
Hmm.
If we are all fundamentally connected on this level of consciousness,
Right.
does that mean our capacity for understanding and relating to each other is far greater than we currently realize?
It's a beautiful and challenging idea to consider. It makes you rethink the very nature of self and other.
And it's not just limited to the realm of human interaction. Panpsychism could also revolutionize our understanding of the animal kingdom.
Oh, interesting.
It could provide a framework for understanding animal consciousness in a way that goes beyond simply observing their behavior.
So instead of trying to determine if animals are conscious based on our own limited human-centric criteria, we might start to appreciate the diversity and complexity of consciousness that exists throughout the animal kingdom.
Exactly. And this new understanding could lead to more ethical and compassionate treatment of animals. It could revolutionize fields like animal welfare and conservation.
This is truly groundbreaking stuff. But I imagine that if panpsychism is true, it would also have major implications for various scientific fields. How could it potentially change the way we approach scientific inquiry?
It would certainly be a paradigm shift. In neuroscience, for example,
Okay.
it would challenge the dominant view that consciousness is solely a product of the brain.
So instead of just focusing on neurons firing and the physical structures of the brain, We'd need to consider the possibility that consciousness might be a fundamental property of those neurons themselves, or even something that permeates the entire brain in a way we don't yet understand.
Exactly. And this would lead to new ways of investigating consciousness, new research questions, new experimental approaches.
It would be a whole new frontier of scientific exploration. And what about physics? How could panpsychism impact our understanding of the fundamental laws of the universe?
Well, if consciousness is truly fundamental, as panpsychism suggests,
Yeah.
then it might not be something that simply emerges from physical processes, but rather something that is woven into the very fabric of reality itself.
So it's not just a byproduct of the universe, it's an essential ingredient.
Yes, and that could have profound implications for our understanding of concepts like space, time, and causality.
It's almost like we'd need to add consciousness to our list of fundamental forces alongside gravity and electromagnetism.
It's a radical idea, but it's one that some physicists are starting to consider.
Wow.
There's a growing field of study called quantum consciousness that explores the potential connections between consciousness and the strange world of quantum mechanics.
It's fascinating to think that the exploration of consciousness could lead us to a deeper understanding of the universe and its most fundamental laws. But let's come back to Earth for a moment. On a personal level, how could panpsychism change the way we live our lives? How could it impact our day-to-day experiences?
It could lead to a greater sense of wonder and appreciation for the world around us.
Okay.
If we see consciousness in everything, from the trees and the forest to the stars in the sky, it changes how we experience those things.
It's like the world suddenly becomes much richer and more alive, full of hidden depths and meaning.
Exactly. And it could also lead to a deeper sense of connection to others, both human and non-human. If we recognize that we are all part of this vast web of consciousness, it fosters a sense of empathy and belonging.
It's a beautiful vision, but it's also a challenging one. How do we live in a world where everything is potentially conscious? How do we make decisions, take actions, knowing that we might be impacting countless other forms of awareness?
That's a question that panpsychism forces us to confront.
Yeah.
It doesn't provide easy answers, but it encourages us to live with a heightened sense of awareness and responsibility.
It's a call to live more thoughtfully, more ethically, more attuned to the interconnectedness of all things.
Precisely.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation, and I feel like we've only just begun to explore the vast implications of panpsychism. But before we wrap things up, I want to come back to something we touched on earlier, the potential impact of panpsychism on our understanding of the human mind.
That's a key area where panpsychism could lead to significant breakthroughs.
I'm ready to delve deeper into that in the final part of our deep dive. Let's continue exploring the fascinating world of panpsychism. We're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive on panpsychism. I'm really fascinated by this idea that it could change how we think about the human mind.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most exciting areas of exploration when we think about panpsychism.
Okay.
If consciousness is fundamental, like panpsychism suggests, it means our minds aren't just products of our brains. They're part of a much larger web of awareness.
Okay, so that challenges the traditional view of the mind as separate from the world, right?
Exactly. Instead of seeing the mind as like a container locked inside our skulls, we might start to think of it more like a radio receiver,
Okay.
constantly tuning in to the symphony of consciousness that permeates the universe.
So our thoughts, feelings, and experiences might not be entirely self-contained,
Rush.
but rather influenced by this broader field of consciousness.
It's a possibility that panpsychism opens up. It suggests that our minds are constantly interacting with and being shaped by the consciousness that exists in everything around us.
That's wild. What implications could this have for our understanding of things like perception, memory, or even creativity?
Well, for one thing, it challenges the idea that our perceptions are simply passive reflections of the external world.
Okay.
If consciousness is fundamental, our perceptions might be more like active engagements with the consciousness that exists in the things we perceive.
So we're not just passively receiving information, but actively co-creating our experience of reality through our interactions with the consciousness that's out there.
That's one way to think about it.
Yeah.
And it could also have implications for how we understand memory. Instead of seeing memories as like static recordings stored in our brains, we might start to think of them as dynamic patterns of consciousness
Okay.
that are constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences.
So our memories might not be fixed, but rather fluid and evolving.
Exactly. And what about creativity? If our minds are part of a larger web of consciousness,
Right.
then the act of creation might be seen as tapping into that web, drawing inspiration and insights from the collective consciousness.
It's like we're not just coming up with ideas on our own, but rather channeling something much larger than ourselves.
It's a beautiful and inspiring way to think about creativity.
This is blowing my mind, but how does any of this translate into tangible changes in our lives?
Yeah.
If we start to see our minds as part of this interconnected web of consciousness, how does that actually change the way we live?
For one thing, it could lead to a deeper sense of empathy and compassion for others. If we recognize that we're all sharing in this universal consciousness, it becomes harder to see ourselves as separate and isolated.
It's like that saying, we're all just waves in the same ocean.
Exactly. And this realization could have a profound impact on our relationships, our communities, and even our global interactions.
Wow.
It could foster a sense of unity and interconnectedness that transcends cultural, social, and political boundaries.
It's a powerful vision, but it also seems incredibly challenging to put into practice.
Yeah.
How do we cultivate the sense of interconnectedness in a world that often feels so divided?
It's not easy, but there are practices that can help us tune in to this larger field of consciousness, things like meditation, mindfulness, and spending time in nature.
Okay.
These practices can help us quiet the noise of our own thoughts and open ourselves up to the subtle but pervasive presence of consciousness all around us.
So it's about cultivating a sense of awareness, both of our own internal states and of the interconnectedness of all things.
Precisely, and as we become more attuned to this web of consciousness, we might start to experience the world in a fundamentally different way. We might feel a deeper sense of belonging, a greater sense of purpose, and a more profound appreciation for the beauty and wonder of existence.
This has been such an amazing deep dive, and I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on the nature of reality and my place in it. Thanks for joining me and exploring these mind-blowing ideas. And to everyone listening out there, keep questioning, stay curious, and never stop exploring the mysteries of the universe.
It's been a pleasure.